On a humid October night in 1987, 16-year-old Miranda Cole slipped through her bedroom window into the thick Alabama darkness, her heart pounding with the reckless excitement that only forbidden love could bring. The air hung heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and impending rain, while crickets provided a symphony for secrets in the small town of Willowdale. She had no way of knowing that within hours, her name would be whispered in horror throughout the sleepy community, and that this autumn evening would mark the beginning of a mystery that would tear the very fabric of their insular world apart. The Cole family's modest ranch house sat at the end of Maple Street, where streetlights barely penetrated the canopy of ancient oak trees. Miranda moved like a shadow across the dew-dampened grass, her white sneakers silent against the earth. Behind her, the warm glow from her parents' television flickered through drawn curtains. They were watching the evening news, unaware that their youngest daughter was about to become the lead story. 3 miles away in the affluent Hillcrest neighborhood, 18-year-old Preston Blackwood adjusted his collar in the mirror of his father's Mercedes-Benz. The gleaming silver sedan was just one of several luxury vehicles in the Blackwood family's circular driveway, testament to their position as Willowdale's most prominent family. Preston's father owned the largest cotton processing plant in 3 counties, and his mother chaired every charity committee that mattered. Their money had always bought Preston everything he wanted, except genuine respect from his peers, who saw through his polished exterior to the cruel, entitled core beneath. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight he would finally have Miranda Cole, the girl who had haunted his thoughts since she'd transferred to Willowdale High at the beginning of junior year. She was beautiful in a way that made grown men stop and stare. Long auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun gold, emerald eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets, and a figure that had developed early, bringing both blessing and curse to a girl still learning how to navigate the dangerous waters of adolescent desire. Preston had watched her for months, studying her patterns, learning her weaknesses. He knew about her troubled home life, her father's drinking problem, her mother's prescription drug dependency. He understood that Miranda was desperate to escape the suffocating poverty and dysfunction that defined her daily existence, and he knew exactly how to exploit that desperation. The third member of their unholy trinity was Tommy Hayes, 17 years old and everything Preston secretly wished he could be. Tommy was Willowdale High's star quarterback, beloved by teachers and students alike. Despite coming from one of the town's poorest families, his natural charisma and genuine kindness had earned him a popularity that Preston's money could never buy. But Tommy carried his own darkness, a deep-seated insecurity about his family's poverty and a desperate need to belong that made him susceptible to Preston's influence. The 3 young men had spent countless evenings that summer, driving the back roads of Willowdale County, drinking stolen whiskey and sharing increasingly violent fantasies. What started as teenage bravado had slowly morphed into something more sinister as Preston began to articulate his obsession with Miranda Cole. He spoke of her as if she were a prize to be won, an object to be possessed rather than a human being with her own thoughts and feelings. "She thinks she's too good for us," Preston had said one night in August, his words slurred by alcohol and entitlement. "Especially too good for me. But I'll show her different." Jake had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You want her, just take her. What's she gonna do about it?" Tommy had shifted uncomfortably in the back seat of Preston's car, some part of him recognizing the dangerous territory their conversations were entering. But his need to belong, to be accepted by the town's social elite, kept him silent when he should have spoken up. As autumn arrived and school resumed, Preston had begun his careful campaign of seduction. He appeared at Miranda's locker with flowers, offered her rides home when it rained, and slowly wormed his way into her life with a patience that was almost admirable in its persistence. Miranda, flattered by the attention of someone from Willowdale's most prominent family, had begun to soften toward him despite her friends' warnings. The breakthrough had come just a week ago, when Miranda had finally agreed to meet him for what she believed would be their first official date. She had no way of knowing that Preston had already shared every detail of their conversations with Jake and Tommy, turning her private confidences into ammunition for his ultimate plan. Now, as midnight approached on October 15th, 1987, all the pieces were in place. Miranda arrived at the designated meeting spot, an old covered bridge that spanned Willow Creek on the outskirts of town, precisely at the agreed-upon time. The structure dated back to the 1920s and had become a popular gathering place for Willowdale's teenagers, hidden enough from adult supervision to provide the perfect venue for underage drinking and other forbidden activities. Preston was waiting for her, leaning against his Mercedes with practiced casual elegance. In the moonlight, he looked almost like the romantic hero she'd imagined him to be. Tall and lean, with dark hair and sharp features that belonged in a magazine rather than a small Alabama town. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of vulnerability to make her heart flutter. "I almost didn't," Miranda admitted, suddenly feeling foolish in her carefully chosen outfit, a pale blue dress that her mother had worn to her own high school prom 20 years earlier. "My parents would kill me if they knew I was here." "Then we'll make sure they never find out," Preston said, offering her his arm with old-fashioned gallantry. "Come on, I've got something special planned." He led her onto the covered bridge, where she was surprised to discover Jake Donovan and Tommy Hayes waiting with a small camping lantern and several bottles of what appeared to be expensive whiskey. Her stomach tightened with unease. This wasn't the intimate first date she'd been expecting. "I thought we were going to be alone," she said, taking an instinctive step backward. "We will be," Preston assured her smoothly. "Jake and Tommy were just helping me set up. They're about to leave, aren't you, boys?" But neither young man made any move to depart. Instead, Jake opened one of the whiskey bottles with a theatrical flourish and took a long drink before offering it to Miranda. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying an undertone that made her skin crawl. "Don't be antisocial, it's a party." Miranda looked to Tommy, hoping to find an ally in the boy she'd known since childhood. Tommy Hayes had always been kind to her, protecting her from bullies in middle school and offering genuine friendship even as they'd drifted into different social circles in high school. But tonight, something was different about him. His usual warm smile seemed forced, and he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "I should probably go home," Miranda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's getting late and—" "Nonsense," Preston interrupted, his hand closing around her wrist with gentle but unmistakable firmness. "The night is young, and you look absolutely beautiful. It would be a crime to waste such a perfect evening." The compliment, delivered with Preston's practiced charm, helped ease some of Miranda's anxiety. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe this was just how wealthy kids socialized, with expensive alcohol and casual rule-breaking that would scandalize her working-class parents. "That's my girl," Preston said approvingly, and the possessive pronoun sent an unexpected thrill through her despite the warning bells going off in the back of her mind. As the night wore on, Miranda found herself drinking more than she'd ever consumed in her life. The alcohol made everything seem softer, more dreamlike. Preston's hand on her shoulder felt comforting rather than controlling. Jake's crude jokes seemed amusing rather than threatening. Even Tommy began to relax, sharing stories about football practice and college recruitment letters. But there was something else in the whiskey. Something that made Miranda's thoughts increasingly cloudy and her limbs progressively heavier. The conversation around her began to sound like it was coming from underwater, and when she tried to stand up, the world tilted dangerously. "I don't feel good," she mumbled, her words slurring together. "Something's wrong." "You're just tired," Preston said soothingly, his arm sliding around her waist to support her swaying form. "Maybe you should lie down for a minute." Through the fog in her brain, Miranda realized with growing horror that this had all been planned. The expensive whiskey, the isolated location, the careful timing, none of it had been coincidental. She tried to protest, to fight against the drugs coursing through her system, but her body no longer obeyed her commands. The last thing she remembered clearly was Tommy Hayes turning away from her, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or laughter, And then darkness claimed her, pulling her into an abyss from which she would never emerge. When the sun rose on October 16, 1987, the covered bridge stood empty, except for a few scattered beer bottles and the lingering scent of expensive cologne. Miranda Cole was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never existed at all. Her parents discovered her absence when they went to wake her for school, and found her bedroom window open and her bed unslept in. The initial assumption was that she had simply run away. Troubled teenagers did that. Sometimes, especially girls from difficult home situations. But as the hours passed and Miranda failed to contact any of her friends or relatives, a more sinister possibility began to take shape. By evening, the Willowdale Police Department had organized search parties to comb the surrounding countryside. Volunteers with flashlights and dogs worked through the night, calling Miranda's name into the darkness and praying for an answer that never came. Detective Ray Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the force who had seen his share of domestic disputes and petty crimes, but nothing like this, found himself leading the most important investigation of his career. A tall, weathered man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much human cruelty. Morrison had grown up in Willowdale and knew every family, every secret, every hidden shame in the small community. He also knew, with the instinct that came from decades of police work, that Miranda Cole hadn't simply run away. Something terrible had happened to her, and the longer they went without finding her, the less likely it became that they ever would, at least not alive. The first break in the case came from an unexpected source. Jenny Palmer, Miranda's closest friend since childhood, approached Detective Morrison 3 days after the disappearance with information she'd been too frightened to share earlier. Miranda was scared of Preston Blackwood, Jenny whispered, glancing around nervously as if afraid someone might overhear. She said he'd been following her, showing up places where he had no business being. She thought it was romantic at first, but lately she said it felt more like stalking. Morrison felt his blood chill. The Blackwood family's influence in Willowdale was legendary, their wealth and political connections making them virtually untouchable. Investigating Preston would require delicate handling and absolutely ironclad evidence. Jenny nodded reluctantly. She was meeting him. She said he'd finally asked her out on a real date, and she was excited but also nervous. She made me promise to call the police if she wasn't back by morning. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Tears spilled down Jenny's cheeks. Because I was scared. You don't know what it's like to cross the Blackwoods in this town. They can destroy people. But as Detective Morrison would soon discover, destroying people was exactly what some members of Willowdale's elite did best. And Miranda Cole had unknowingly walked directly into their web of violence and depravity. The investigation took a shocking turn on October 20th, when a group of duck hunters discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Hidden in a dense thicket along Willow Creek, approximately 2 miles downstream from the covered bridge, they found Miranda Cole's pale blue dress torn, stained, and partially buried under a pile of rotting leaves. The dress told a story that no one in Willowdale wanted to believe. Forensic analysis would later reveal traces of blood, semen, and enough physical evidence to paint a horrifying picture of Miranda's final hours. But for now, Detective Morrison simply stared at the delicate fabric and felt his heart break for a young girl who had deserved so much better than the cruel fate that had befallen her. As word of the discovery spread through Willowdale, the small town's carefully maintained facade of southern gentility began to crack. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Parents kept their children indoors after dark, and long-time friendships crumbled under the weight of whispered accusations. At the center of the growing storm stood 3 young men who had everything to lose and nothing left to gain from telling the truth. Preston Blackwood retreated behind his family's wealth and political connections, refusing to speak with police except through his attorney. Jake Donovan disappeared entirely, vanishing from his grandmother's trailer without a trace, and Tommy Hayes continued attending school and football practice as if nothing had happened. maintaining a facade of normalcy that fooled no one who looked closely enough to see the haunted expression in his eyes. Detective Morrison found himself walking a tightrope between justice and politics, knowing that one wrong move could not only end his career, but also allow Miranda's killers to escape punishment forever. The pressure was enormous, coming from the victim's family, the community, and his own conscience. But pressure had a way of revealing character, and Ray Morrison was made of stronger stuff than most people realized. The breakthrough he needed would come from an unexpected source, and when it did, it would expose a conspiracy of violence and corruption that reached into the very heart of Willowdale's power structure. But that revelation was still days away, hidden behind a wall of silence and fear that seemed impenetrable. For now, as October 20th drew to a close, Detective Morrison sat in his office staring at crime scene photographs and trying to piece together the final hours of Miranda Cole's life. Outside his window, the town of Willowdale slept fitfully, plagued by nightmares and the growing realization that evil had taken root in their midst. The investigation was just beginning, but already Morrison could sense that nothing would ever be the same again. The October darkness had claimed an innocent girl, and before justice was served, it would claim much more. In the shadows of the small Alabama town, 3 young men waited and planned and prayed that their secrets would stay buried forever. But secrets, like bodies, have a way of rising to the surface eventually, and Miranda Cole was about to have her final say. The Alabama State Crime Laboratory in Montgomery was a stark, fluorescent-lit temple to forensic science, its sterile corridors echoing with the soft footsteps of technicians who dealt in death and DNA, fibers and fingerprints. Detective Ray Morrison had made the 3-hour drive from Willowdale twice in the past week, each visit bringing him closer to the truth he both needed and dreaded to uncover. Dr. Patricia Vance, the lab's chief forensic analyst, was a small woman in her 50s, whose gentle appearance belied the steel-trapped mind that had helped solve some of Alabama's most notorious crimes. She met Morrison in her office on the morning of October 25th, 10 days after Miranda Cole's disappearance, with a manila folder thick enough to contain either salvation or damnation. "I've never seen a case quite like this," Dr. Vance said without preamble, spreading crime scene photographs across her desk with clinical precision. "The physical evidence tells a very clear story, Ray. The question is whether you're prepared to hear it." Morrison leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. "I've been a cop for 20 years, Doc. I've seen enough horror to last 10 lifetimes. What have you got for me?" "DNA evidence from 3 different male subjects," she said, pointing to laboratory reports that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all Morrison understood of the science behind them. "The technology is still relatively new, but it's reliable enough to hold up in court. We've got semen, blood, and epithelial tissue under the victim's fingernails. She fought them, Ray. She fought hard." The detective felt bile rise in his throat as the implications settled over him. 3 different subjects. "You're certain?" "Absolutely. And there's more." Dr. Vance pulled out a separate file. "We found traces of flunitrazepam in her blood work. English, Doc. Rohypnol, a date rape drug. It wasn't yet illegal in 1987, but it was already being used by predators to incapacitate their victims. Someone planned this, Ray. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was premeditated sexual assault and murder." Morrison closed his eyes and tried to push away the image of 16-year-old Miranda Cole fighting for her life against 3 attackers, while drugs coursed through her system, weakening her ability to defend herself. When he opened them again, Vance was watching him with sympathy that came from years of delivering similar news to law enforcement officers who still possessed functioning consciences. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "The ballistics report came back on the shotgun pellets we recovered. They're from a Mossberg 512 gauge. The shell casings we found near the creek are Winchester Super X buckshot. Not common ammunition, but not rare either. Any way to trace the purchase?" That's your department, not mine. But Ray? She reached across the desk and touched his hand briefly. Yet these bastards. That girl deserved better than what they gave her. What he got instead was Jake Donovan's grandmother. Ida Mae Donovan was 73 years old, bent with arthritis, and possessed of the kind of moral clarity that came from a lifetime of hard choices and harder consequences. She appeared at the Willowdale Police Department on the afternoon of October 26th, clutching a paper bag that contained what she described as the devil's own arsenal. "That boy ain't been right since he was small," she told Morrison, her voice cracked with age and sorrow. "I tried to raise him proper after his mama died, but there's a darkness in him that prayer couldn't touch. I found these hidden in his room after he ran off." The bag contained photographs, dozens of them, Polaroids that depicted acts of animal cruelty so disturbing that Morrison had to step outside for fresh air before continuing his examination. There were also newspaper clippings about unsolved crimes in neighboring counties, detailed sketches of torture devices, and a journal filled with violent fantasies written in Jake's distinctive scrawl. But the most damning piece of evidence was a single photograph tucked into the journal's back cover. Miranda Cole, taken without her knowledge as she walked home from school. On the back, someone had written "Soon" in red ink. "When did you find these?" Morrison asked. "Day after that poor girl went missing," Ida Mae replied, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I knew then what he'd done, but I was scared. Scared of what people would say, scared of what might happen to me. But I can't carry this burden anymore. Detective, that child deserves justice, even if it means my own blood goes to prison." The photographs and journal gave Morrison probable cause, but he still needed to locate Jake Donovan. The young man had vanished completely, leaving no forwarding address and no trace of where he might have gone. It was as if he'd simply evaporated into the October mist. The break came from an unexpected source: Tommy Hayes. Morrison found the star quarterback after football practice on October 28th, sitting alone on the bleachers and staring out at the empty field where he'd once been the undisputed king. 2 weeks of living with his secret had transformed Tommy from a confident young man into a hollow-eyed ghost who jumped at every shadow. "We need to talk," Morrison said simply, settling onto the bleacher beside him. Tommy didn't look up. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. The question is whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem." "She was so scared," he said. At the end, when she realized what was happening, she kept saying please over and over again. Just please, like it was the only word she remembered. Morrison felt his heart stop. "Tell me what happened, son." The story that poured out of Tommy Hayes was a nightmare of peer pressure, cowardice, and moral failure that would haunt Morrison for the rest of his life. Tommy described how Preston had orchestrated everything, from drugging Miranda's whiskey to selecting the isolated location where they could assault her without fear of discovery. "I tried to stop it," Tommy insisted, though his words carried no conviction. "When I realized what Preston really intended, I told him we should just take her home. But Jake said, if I didn't participate, they'd tell everyone I was a coward, that I'd lose my scholarship, my future, everything." "So you participated in rape and murder to protect your reputation?" Tommy flinched as if Morrison had struck him. "It wasn't supposed to go that far. Preston said we'd just scare her a little, maybe get her to be friendlier. But once Jake got started, there was no stopping him. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed hurting her." "What about Preston?" "Preston filmed it," Tommy said, his voice breaking. "He had this video camera, said he wanted to remember the moment he finally got what he wanted. But when Jake started getting violent, really violent, Preston got scared. He tried to make him stop, but Jake wasn't listening anymore." Morrison felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Who killed her?" Tommy was silent for so long that Morrison began to wonder if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, as if he needed to expel them from his system before they poisoned him completely. "We all did. That's the truth of it. Jake was the one holding the shotgun, but we all pulled that trigger. Preston by planning it, me by not stopping it, and Jake by, Tommy shuddered, by enjoying it. The confession was everything Morrison needed to build his case, but it came with a price. Tommy Hayes was 17 years old, a minor under Alabama law, and his cooperation would be essential for convicting the other two. Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of negotiating with someone who had participated in the brutal murder of an innocent girl. "I want immunity," Tommy said, suddenly sounding more like a defendant than a witness. "Full immunity in exchange for my testimony." "That's not my decision to make," Morrison replied. "But I can tell you this. Cooperate fully. Tell the complete truth, and I'll recommend leniency. Hold back anything. Lie about even the smallest detail, and I'll throw you to the wolves." Tommy nodded miserably. "There's something else you need to know about where Jake went." "I'm listening." "Preston's family has a hunting lodge in the Talladega National Forest. Jake's been staying there waiting for things to cool down. Preston's been bringing him supplies, money, everything he needs to disappear permanently." Morrison felt adrenaline surge through his veins. "Show me." The Blackwood Hunting Lodge was a monument to excess, a sprawling log structure that had cost more than most Willowdale families earned in a decade. It sat in a clearing surrounded by thousands of acres of pristine wilderness, accessible only by a single dirt road that would be easy to block and impossible to escape from unnoticed. Morrison assembled a team carefully, calling in favors from state police officers he trusted, and avoiding any local personnel who might have connections to the Blackwood family. At dawn on October 30th, 15 days after Miranda Cole's disappearance, they moved on the lodge with overwhelming force. They found Jake Donovan exactly where Tommy had said he would be, sitting on the lodge's wraparound porch, cleaning a shotgun that forensics would later identify as the murder weapon. He offered no resistance when Morrison placed him under arrest, but the smile that played at the corners of his mouth was more disturbing than any show of violence could have been. "Took you long enough," Jake said as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I was starting to get bored." "Jacob Donovan, you're under arrest for the murder of Miranda Cole, among other things," Jake replied cryptically. It wasn't until they were processing him at the county jail that Morrison discovered what Jake meant. Hidden in the lodge's basement, they found a collection of trophies, personal items taken from victims of crimes that had never been solved. Hair ribbons, jewelry, clothing, and photographs that painted a picture of a serial predator who had been operating in the region for years. Miranda Cole hadn't been Jake's first victim. She had simply been his most ambitious target, the crime that finally brought him to the attention of law enforcement. The discovery sent shockwaves through multiple jurisdictions as cold cases were reopened and evidence was re-examined. But for Morrison, the focus remained on bringing justice for Miranda. Everything else was secondary to that mission. Preston Blackwood's arrest came 3 days later, and it was a masterpiece of political theater. Morrison timed the arrest for maximum public impact, waiting until Preston was holding court in the school cafeteria, surrounded by his usual crowd of admirers and hangers-on. "Preston Blackwood," Morrison announced in a voice that carried across the suddenly silent room, "you're under arrest for the rape and murder of Miranda Cole." The Blackwood family's response was swift and predictable. Within hours, a team of high-powered attorneys had descended on Willowdale, threatening lawsuits and demanding their client's immediate release. Judge Harold Westbrook, a longtime family friend, set Preston's bail at $50,000, a fraction of what it should have been for someone charged with capital murder. Preston was free within 6 hours of his arrest, but his freedom came at a cost that even his family's wealth couldn't fully cover. The media attention brought something the Blackwood family had never experienced: scrutiny. Reporters began digging into Preston's past, uncovering a pattern of violent behavior that had been covered up by money and influence for years. Stories emerged about incidents at his previous school, about young women who had been paid to remain silent about sexual assaults, about a family that had used its wealth as a shield against consequences. But Preston's arrest also had an unintended consequence. It made him desperate. On the night of November 5th, exactly 3 weeks after Miranda's disappearance, Preston made a decision that would change everything. He drove to Tommy Hayes's house under cover of darkness, parking his Mercedes in the shadows behind the garage where it wouldn't be seen from the street. Tommy was alone. His mother was working a double shift at the hospital, and his younger sister was spending the night with friends. When he answered the door, he found himself face to face with a Preston Blackwood he'd never seen before. Wild-eyed, unshaven, and radiating the kind of dangerous energy that comes from a cornered animal. "We need to talk," Preston said, pushing past Tommy into the house. "Preston, you shouldn't be here. If anyone sees—" "Shut up." Preston's voice cracked like a whip. "Just shut up and listen. Jake's talking to the police. He's trying to make a deal, trying to pin everything on us to save himself." Tommy felt his blood turn to ice water. "What kind of deal?" "He's claiming it was our idea, that he was just following orders. He's saying you and I planned the whole thing and forced him to participate." "What do you want from me?" Tommy asked. Preston reached into his jacket and pulled out a snub-nosed revolver that gleamed dully in the living room's lamplight. "I want you to disappear, Tommy. Tonight. Forever. You're crazy if you think I'm running. That would just make me look guilty." "You are guilty," Preston hissed. "We all are. But if you stay here, if you testify against me, my family will destroy you. They'll destroy your family, your future, everything you've ever cared about." Tommy stared at the gun, his mind racing through possibilities and calculations. Preston was right about one thing. Testifying against the Blackwood family would come with a price. What running would be an admission of guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Put the gun away, Preston. This isn't the answer." "The answer?" Preston laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The answer is that a worthless piece of trash is dead, and now everyone wants to act like she was some kind of saint. She was nothing, Tommy. Nothing but a poor girl who thought she could climb above her station by spreading her legs for the right people." The words hit Tommy like physical blows, finally forcing him to confront the true nature of what they had done. Miranda Cole hadn't been nothing. She had been someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's hope for the future, and they had snuffed out that future for no better reason than their own sick pleasure. "You're a monster," Tommy whispered. Preston's finger tightened on the trigger. "We're all monsters, Tommy. The only difference is that some of us are honest about it." The standoff stretched for an eternity. Two young men staring at each other across a chasm of guilt and fear that seemed impossible to bridge. Outside, November wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance a police siren wailed like a banshee. Finally, Preston lowered the gun. "You've got 12 hours, he said. 12 hours to disappear, or I'll make sure you disappear permanently." After Preston left, Tommy sat alone in his family's modest living room and tried to decide between two kinds of death: the literal death that Preston threatened, or the spiritual death that would come from running away and spending the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. In the end, the decision was made for him. At 3 in the morning, Detective Morrison received a phone call that would bring the case to its shocking conclusion. On the other end of the line, Tommy Hayes was crying so hard that Morrison could barely understand what he was saying. "He's going to kill me," Tommy sobbed. "Preston came here tonight with a gun. He said I have to run or he'll make me disappear." Morrison was already reaching for his car keys. "Where are you now?" "At home." "But Detective, there's something else. Something I didn't tell you before." "What is it?" Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper, as if he were afraid someone might overhear him confessing his darkest secret to the darkness itself. "Miranda wasn't unconscious when we threw her in the creek. She was still alive." The line went silent except for Tommy's ragged breathing, and Morrison felt the last piece of the puzzle fall into place with sickening clarity. The confession hung in the air between them like a physical weight, too terrible to acknowledge and too important to ignore. Morrison closed his eyes and saw Miranda Cole's final moments, battered, violated, and alone in the cold October darkness, fighting for life even as the creek's current pulled her under. "I'm coming to get you," Morrison said finally. "Don't go anywhere, don't talk to anyone else. Just wait for me." But when Morrison arrived at the Hayes residence 20 minutes later, he found the front door standing open, and Tommy nowhere to be found. A neighbor reported seeing a silver Mercedes speeding away from the house around 3:30 in the morning, but there had been too much darkness to make out the license plate or see who was inside. "I can't live with what we did to Miranda." Preston was right about one thing. We're all monsters, but maybe it's not too late for the truth to mean something. "Detective Morrison, everything I told you was true. Preston planned it, Jake executed it, and I let it happen. I'm sorry that's not enough, but it's all I have left to give." The note was signed and dated, a confession that would hold up in court even if its author was never seen again. As dawn broke over Willowdale on November 6th, Detective Morrison stood in Tommy Hayes's abandoned living room and tried to piece together what had happened during those crucial 30 minutes between his phone call and his arrival. Had Preston actually killed Tommy, or had the guilt-ridden young man simply run away to start a new life somewhere far from Alabama? The answer would determine not just the outcome of his investigation, but the very nature of justice itself. Outside, the November sun climbed higher into a sky that seemed too bright and clean for the darkness it was illuminating. Somewhere in that pristine morning light, the truth waited to be discovered. But Detective Morrison was beginning to suspect that some truths were too terrible for even the light of day to fully reveal. The answer came at first light on November 7th, delivered by two fishermen who had ventured out early to try their luck at Willow Creek's deepest bend. What they found floating face down in the same waters where Miranda Cole had drawn her last breath was Tommy Hayes, still wearing the Willowdale High letter jacket that had once made him the pride of the small Alabama town. Detective Ray Morrison stood on the muddy bank as the coroner's team pulled Tommy's body from the creek and felt something fundamental break inside his chest. The boy's skull had been crushed by a single blow from a heavy object, and his hands showed defensive wounds that told the story of a final, desperate struggle. There would be no need for an autopsy to determine cause of death. Tommy Hayes had been murdered, and Morrison knew exactly who was responsible. But knowing and proving were two different things, especially when dealing with someone who had spent their entire life learning how to use money and privilege as weapons against inconvenient truths. Preston Blackwood's alibi was airtight, at least on the surface. Security cameras at his family's country club showed him entering the building at 11:47 p.m. on November 6th and remaining there until 6:15 a.m. the following morning. The club's night manager, a longtime family employee named Marcus Webb, swore that Preston had been in the private poker room all night, participating in a high-stakes game with several other wealthy young men from Birmingham. It should have been the perfect alibi. It would have been if Morrison hadn't spent 20 years learning to spot the kinds of lies that money could buy. Funny thing about that poker game, Morrison told Assistant District Attorney Caroline Fisher as they reviewed the evidence on November 8th. According to the club's records, the private room was reserved under Preston's name, but the security deposit was paid in cash by someone else entirely. Fisher, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, who had built her reputation prosecuting white-collar crimes in Montgomery before accepting a position in rural Alabama, looked up from the file she'd been studying. Someone else? Who? Marcus Webb, the same night manager who's providing Preston's alibi. Morrison leaned back in his chair and felt his spine pop. Webb's been in the Blackwood family's employ for 15 years. His daughter attends an expensive private school in Atlanta, courtesy of a scholarship funded by Blackwood Industries. His mortgage was mysteriously paid off last year after he'd been struggling with payments for months. You think they bought his testimony? I think the Blackwoods have been buying testimonies, alibis, and silence for so long that they've forgotten there are some things money can't purchase. Fisher spread crime scene photographs across her desk with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to compartmentalize horror as a necessary part of seeking justice. The medical examiner's report confirms that Tommy was. That security footage shows Preston entering the club just before midnight, but there's a significant gap in coverage. How significant? 3 hours, from 2:30 to 5:30 a.m. The cameras covering the club's rear entrance and parking garage experienced what the security company described as a technical malfunction. Fisher's voice carried the kind of skeptical tone that came from years of watching wealthy defendants try to manipulate the justice system. Amazing how these technical malfunctions always seem to occur at the most convenient times. It's circumstantial, but it's enough to build a case. The question is whether a jury will convict the son of Willowdale's most powerful family based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a dead boy. The answer to that question would depend largely on Jake Donovan, whose cooperation had become the linchpin of the prosecution's strategy. But Jake was proving to be as unpredictable in custody as he had been dangerous on the streets. Morrison found him in the interview room of the county jail on November 10th, 3 days after Tommy's murder. Jake sat cuffed to the metal table, his dead eyes fixed on the two-way mirror as if he could see through it, to whatever watchers might be observing from the other side. "Hello, Jake," Morrison said, settling into the chair across from the young killer. "We need to talk." "Do we?" Jake's voice carried the same flat affect it had possessed since his arrest, as if emotion were a luxury he'd never been able to afford. "Seems to me you've got everything you need. DNA evidence, witness statements, that touching confession from poor Tommy before Preston shut him up permanently." The casual acknowledgement of Tommy's murder sent a chill down Morrison's spine. "You're saying Preston killed Tommy?" Jake laughed, a sound like breaking glass in an empty room. "Preston killed Tommy the same way you killed Miranda, detective, by creating the circumstances that made her death inevitable." "What do you mean?" "I mean that little rich boy set everything in motion, but he didn't have the stomach to see it through to the end. When things got messy, when Tommy started growing a conscience, Preston did what rich boys always do. He hired someone else to clean up his mess." Morrison felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, forming a picture that was somehow even more disturbing than what he'd originally imagined. He hired someone to kill Tommy. Marcus Webb wasn't just providing an alibi, detective, he was providing a service. The Blackwood family has been using him to handle their personnel problems for years. You should ask him about the other accidents and suicides that have plagued people who threaten to expose their secrets. The revelation opened up investigative possibilities that Morrison had never considered. If Jake was telling the truth, then Tommy's murder wasn't an isolated act of desperation. It was part of a systematic pattern of witness elimination that went back years. "Why are you telling me this?" Morrison asked. Jake's smile was a razor blade, wrapped in human flesh. "Because I'm tired of being the only monster in this room. Detective, Preston wants to paint me as the mastermind, the evil influence who corrupted 2 innocent boys. But the truth is that Preston Blackwood is everything I am, plus the money and social position to get away with it. And what are you, Jake?" The young man leaned forward as far as his restraints would allow, his pale eyes boring into Morrison's soul. "I'm what happens when society creates a monster and then acts surprised when it starts killing people. I'm the product of every adult who looked the other way while I tortured animals, every teacher who ignored the signs, every system that failed to intervene when intervention might have made a difference. That doesn't excuse what you did to Miranda." "Nothing excuses what we did to Miranda," Jake agreed. "But at least I'm honest about what I am. Preston still thinks he's the victim in all of this." The interview continued for another 2 hours, during which Jake provided details about the Blackwood family's criminal activities that would take months to fully investigate. By the time Morrison left the jail, he carried with him the framework for a conspiracy case that reached far beyond the murder of 2 teenagers. But building that case would require resources and political support. that Morrison wasn't sure he could obtain. The Blackwood family's influence extended into the highest levels of Alabama's political and judicial establishment, and challenging them meant risking everything he had spent his career building. The decision was taken out of his hands on November 12th, when the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived in Willowdale, with warrants, subpoenas, and the kind of investigative firepower that could crack even the most carefully constructed conspiracy. Special Agent Diana Torres was a compact woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had spent the past 15 years building cases against organized crime families in New York and Chicago, and the Blackwood operation, while smaller in scope, exhibited many of the same characteristics as the criminal enterprises she'd spent her career dismantling. "We've been watching the Blackwood family for 2 years," Torres told Morrison during their first meeting. "Not for murder initially, but for money laundering and tax evasion connected to their cotton processing business. When your case broke, it provided the missing pieces we needed to understand the full scope of their criminal activities." The federal investigation moved with terrifying efficiency. Within a week, agents had seized financial records, conducted surveillance, and begun building a case that connected Miranda's murder to a broader pattern of criminal behavior that stretched back more than a decade. Marcus Webb was arrested on November 18th, while attempting to board a flight to Mexico City with 3 false passports and $2 million in cash. Under interrogation, he provided details about his role in Tommy's murder that corroborated Jake's accusations and provided the direct link to Preston that Morrison had been seeking. "Preston called me at midnight," Webb told federal agents during his confession. "Said there was a problem that needed to be handled quietly. He offered me $50,000 to make Tommy Hayes disappear permanently." "And you agreed?" "I've been handling problems for that family since Preston was in middle school. This was just another problem, bigger than most, but not fundamentally different." The confession broke the case wide open. Armed with Webb's testimony and the financial records that proved payment for Tommy's murder, federal prosecutors obtained arrest warrants for Preston Blackwood on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, and racketeering. Preston's second arrest was less theatrical than his first, but infinitely more final. Federal agents took him into custody at his family's estate on November 20th. Exactly 6 weeks after Miranda Cole's disappearance had set everything in motion. This time there would be no bail. This time there would be no escape. The trial of Preston Blackwood began on March 15, 1988, in the federal courthouse in Birmingham. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Chen, presented a case that methodically connected Preston to both murders through financial records, witness testimony, and forensic evidence that painted a picture of calculated evil disguised as privilege. Jake Donovan testified for 4 days, describing in clinical detail how Preston had planned Miranda's assault, how the evening had spiraled into murder, and how Preston had arranged Tommy's death to prevent his testimony. His flat, emotionless delivery made his words even more chilling, like listening to a coroner describe an autopsy. Marcus Webb's testimony was equally damaging, providing the jury with a window into the Blackwood family's criminal operations that went far beyond the murders of 2 teenagers. He described years of witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and violent crime hidden behind a facade of respectability and charitable giving. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source: Preston's own father, Harrison Blackwood. The elder Blackwood took the stand on March 28th, called as a witness by the prosecution over the vigorous objections of his son's defense team. His testimony lasted 3 hours and effectively ended any hope Preston might have had for acquittal. "I raised a monster," Harrison Blackwood said, his voice breaking as he looked across the courtroom at his son. "I taught him that money could solve any problem, that influence could overcome any obstacle, that consequences were for other people. I failed as a father, and Miranda Cole and Tommy Hayes paid the price for that failure." The confession was devastating, not just for its content, but for its source. when one of Alabama's most powerful men publicly acknowledged his son's guilt and his own complicity in creating the conditions that made that guilt possible. The jury's verdict became a foregone conclusion. Preston Blackwood was found guilty on all charges on April 2, 1988. 2 weeks later, Judge Patricia Williams sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charges, plus additional decades for the conspiracy and racketeering convictions. Jake Donovan, in exchange for his cooperation and detailed confession, received a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. He would be eligible for release in 2018, assuming he survived that long in the Alabama prison system. Marcus Webb was sentenced to 25 years for his role in Tommy's murder and the broader conspiracy. He would serve every day of that sentence, dying of cancer in federal prison. The trials and convictions marked the end of one chapter in Willowdale's history, but the beginning of another. The federal investigation had exposed corruption that reached into every level of local government, from the police department to the courthouse to the mayor's office. By the time the dust settled, more than 20 people had been indicted on charges ranging from bribery to conspiracy. But personal advancement couldn't fill the hole that Miranda Cole's death had torn in his soul. Morrison continued to work cases, continued to seek justice for victims of violent crime, but something fundamental had changed in him during those dark October weeks. He had seen too much of humanity's capacity for evil, had witnessed too many failures of the systems he'd devoted his life to serving. The changes weren't limited to law enforcement. The Blackwood family's criminal empire collapsed in the wake of the convictions, taking with it hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars in economic activity. The cotton processing plant closed permanently, unable to survive the scandal and federal oversight that followed the trials. Willowdale itself seemed to wither in the aftermath, its population declining as families moved away, seeking fresh starts in places not haunted by the memory of what had happened to Miranda Cole. The covered bridge where she had met her fate became a pilgrimage site of sorts, visited by people seeking to understand how such evil could flourish in such an ordinary place. On October 15, 1989, exactly 2 years after Miranda's disappearance, Morrison stood on that same bridge as autumn darkness gathered around him. The memorial that local teenagers had created for Miranda had grown over the months. Flowers, photographs, letters, and small personal items left by people who had never known her but felt connected to her story. As Morrison stood in the gathering dusk, he reflected on the price of justice and the weight of truth. Preston Blackwood and his conspirators had been convicted and imprisoned, but their punishment couldn't restore the lives they had destroyed or heal the community they had torn apart. Miranda Cole remained dead, her potential unfulfilled, her family forever shattered by grief and the knowledge of how she had suffered in her final moments. Tommy Hayes remained dead as well, his attempt at redemption cut short by a bullet paid for with blood money. The only justice Morrison had come to understand was the imperfect, incomplete kind that human institutions could provide. True justice, the kind that could balance the scales of cosmic unfairness, belonged to a higher authority than any earthly court. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the knowledge that evil had been exposed, that truth had prevailed despite money and influence and systematic corruption, perhaps that was the only victory that mortals could reasonably expect. As Morrison turned to leave the bridge, his flashlight beam caught something that made him pause. Someone had recently placed a single white rose on Miranda's memorial, so fresh that dew still clung to its petals. There was no note, no identifier, just the rose and the implicit message it carried. She had not been forgotten. The evil had been purged, the guilty punished, the truth revealed. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was human justice. And perhaps that was enough. In the distance, a church bell tolled midnight, marking the end of another day and the beginning of another attempt at redemption in a world that needed all the redemption it could get. The covered bridge had been torn down years earlier, replaced by a modern concrete structure that served the same utilitarian purpose, but carried none of the dark history of its predecessor. The Blackwood estate had been sold and subdivided, its mansion demolished and replaced with modest homes for working families. Preston Blackwood had died in prison in 2003, killed by another inmate in a dispute over gambling debts. Jake Donovan had been granted parole in 2018 after serving 31 years, but had been found dead in a homeless shelter in Mobile just 6 months later, his body ravaged by hepatitis and decades of institutional living. Marcus Webb had died as scheduled, his cancer consuming him slowly and painfully in the sterile confines of federal prison. The evil that had once flourished in Willowdale was gone, its architects dead or broken by time and consequence. But Miranda Cole's memory lived on, preserved in the hearts of people who had never known her but understood what she represented. Innocence destroyed by privilege, truth buried under corruption, justice delayed but never denied. As Morrison stood in the small cemetery where Miranda was buried, listening to her mother, now gray-haired and bent with age, speak about forgiveness and healing, he reflected on the strange paths that justice could take. The case that had defined his career was over, its mysteries solved and its perpetrators punished. But the real victory, Morrison had come to understand, wasn't in the convictions or the prison sentences. It was in the simple fact that people still remembered, still cared, still gathered on autumn afternoons to honor a girl whose life had been cut short by the casual cruelty of those who believed themselves above consequence. That, perhaps, was the truest justice of all. The refusal to forget, the determination to remember, the insistence that every life, no matter how briefly lived, mattered enough to be mourned and celebrated and preserved in the collective memory of a community. As the sun set over the Alabama countryside, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Morrison placed a single white rose on Miranda Cole's grave and whispered a promise that had taken him 25 years to understand. Your story will never be forgotten. In the gathering dusk, with autumn wind rustling through the cemetery's ancient oaks, it almost seemed as though someone whispered back, "Thank you." The October darkness had finally lifted, replaced by something approaching peace.